Imagine this. 3 years ago, would anyone believe that a disease can kill over 1 million people in the United States and a few million more around the world? 3 years ago, would anyone believe that the United States COVID response can be a total failure and that the country would refuse to share their vaccines to developing countries around the world?
I'm Dr. Margaret Flowers. I'm a pediatrician based in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States.
Margaret Flowers, Director of Popular Resistance, has long been an activist for a national public health care system in the United States.
The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed in the United States the real failures of our profit-driven healthcare system and the inequalities that we experience here in the United States. Because we didn't have any sort of national framework with which to organize a response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
While the United States has one of the world's largest, most funded and supposedly most advanced healthcare system in the world, it nonetheless failed miserably in the fight against the COVID-19.
But the past 2 years, we've had everything closed down in New York and people have suffered tremendously. I've known people who've died. Most of the people who I've known who've died were people of color, and some of the sickest people, some of our service workers, many nurses. I'm an old nurse, and many of our nurses died of COVID and have people who they know who've died and have been traumatized by the workloads they've had. I went back to work and it was really, really difficult. So between the patients I worked for and the people I knew personally, I guess it's about 20 or 30 people. In fact, hundreds, I think. We really have a lot of people, including myself. People in New York aren't having the worst cases of COVID for the most part.
美国的新冠抗疫政策证明是一个完全失败，完全是一个没办法接受的一个笑话，世界的大笑话。
Li Su-hin, a Chinese-American community organizer from Los Angeles, California, a former Pacifica Radio KPFK Los Angeles reporter, and a longtime activist on immigrant workers' rights, peace, and social justice. Currently, he travels between China and the United States for binational activist solidarity movement and to build medical solidarity project for the global south.
The U.S. has accounted for 1/6 of recorded global cases and deaths, with just 4% of the global population. Why? It's the American expansionism that arrogant U.S. government refuse to work with international communities to collectively fight against the virus, even launching economic and medical sanctions against other countries. 当美国说所谓的中国病毒论这种方言，在过去3年，美国和西方国家其实他们就是正在向全世界散毒播毒，包括这几年以来，中美之间，美国有很多回到中国的旅客，在机场新冠检测的时候发现阳性。
So from the beginning, this different approach of China in conditions of quarantine with an unknown virus and how to coordinate the testing, how to utilize masking and emergency measures was completely different from the US and also the European imperialist powers.
Sarah Flounders.
Hello, I'm Sarah Flounders, a political activist and organizer in the United States. I work with the International Action Center, the United National Anti-War Coalition. I'm a contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper, and I've been active for decades in people's struggles in the U.S. and against endless U.S. wars. At this point now, in the United States, there is a complete ignoring of the impact of COVID. The message again and again is just go on with life. People are not wearing masks. even on public transportation, in large sports and concert and music gatherings. It's rare to see people wearing masks or taking any precautions whatsoever. Now, why is this? According to US figures at this time, 93% of the deaths are in people over 50. This is a very expendable part of the population. The deaths are also among people with pre-existing conditions, for that is considered a drain on the economy. Again, it's people who are expendable. So life is going on in the midst of COVID pandemic.
It's the US capitalist greed and COVID racism caused more inner city poor people of color communities and other people died from the pandemic. 疫苗帝国主义，美国奉行的这个政策，把全世界很急需的疫苗大量的采购，大量的囤积，造成疫苗在南方国家不够，买不到，或者是就算想买，也买不到很便宜的价钱。
There were shortages throughout the country of basic supplies to protect our healthcare workers, and counties and states fighting with each other and making deals, in secret to try to get the equipment that they needed to deal with the pandemic. For the long time in the United States, we have had, really from the beginning of the country, inequalities in the treatment of people based on their race and based on their income. And this has played out in a devastating way in the COVID-19 pandemic, where communities, Black and Brown communities, have really faced the brunt, and Native American and Alaskan communities have really faced the brunt of this pandemic.
For a number of reasons. One reason is that there were barriers for getting vaccination and treatment. So people need access to the internet and really took quite a bit of time to make an appointment for vaccination. And this is something particularly difficult for people who have more than one job, who take care of their families, and who don't have easy and reliable access to the internet. They're not able to make appointments. But there was also a lot of mistrust in the healthcare system of the United States in general, because it is driven by profit and not by the needs of the people. This is particularly true for the Black and the Brown communities, who have been historically discriminated against in our healthcare system and thus have an innate mistrust to the system. There was a lot of misinformation going around about medications, about vaccinations, about how serious the pandemic was, and all of these create doubts and deteriorate the mistrust that people have in our healthcare system. Sadly, up till now, the white people are even more likely to die from the COVID than people of color. Because of the anti-vax movement, many white people refuse to be vaccinated. As a result, many vaccines have been wasted and not enough people take the jab.
It's true that former President Donald Trump is responsible for most of the blame of the US COVID disaster. But be honest, President Biden also shared many blame as well. It's the fact that under his administration, more people infected and died from the COVID for the past 2 years. Here's the one head who spread the false endemic myth, lifting almost all COVID restrictions and taking away the pandemic emergency funds to support the US NATO proxy war in Ukraine.
So there was really no set system in the United States to give clear, accurate, timely information and to get the supplies, including vaccines, to the places where they were needed the most. In addition to that, Black and Brown communities struggled because there's a higher proportion of people in those communities who work in what are considered essential jobs, service jobs. And so they continued working, but they didn't receive the materials that they needed or the education that they needed to protect themselves. There have been countless complaints filed with the Occupation Safety and Health Administration over workplaces just not providing what the employees needed, forcing them to work in dangerous conditions, and so resulting in more illnesses and outbreaks in the places of employment. Because of this, over the past 2 years in the United States, we have seen a real decline in life expectancy.
In January 2020, several cases of viral pneumonia of unknown origin were detected in the central Chinese city of Wuhan. No one knew exactly what the virus was, hence the vague identifier of coronavirus so popularly known today. Thousands of miles away in the US, when the virus was believed not to have reached the soil yet, right-wing US elites, media, and politicians began using callous words to ridicule China, calling the virus China's Chernobyl. US Senator Tom Cotton, famous for his anti-China rhetoric, along with the right-wing media and the liberal Washington Post, began spreading the Wuhan military lab-made virus conspiracy theory. China mobilized the national efforts to beat the odds and successfully contain the virus within 3 months. When the Wuhan lockdown was lifted on April 8, 2020, it marked the official end of the COVID-19 crisis in China. But no one would have predicted that the pandemic would spread rapidly to Europe or that the US would become the COVID-19 epicenter, hosting nearly a quarter of cases and deaths all over the globe.
中国抗疫成功的经验和美国的失败，表明中国的社会主义制度的成功，在这方面的成功和美国资本产阶级制度的失败，因为他们不是以人为本。另外一个很关键的就是表现出美国的自大和自私和短视，从左到右都是一样，他们情愿花更多的时间去搞这些所谓反华反共运动，而不把心思放在怎么跟其他国家合作，包括学习中国的成功的抗疫经验，去想办法在美国可以抗疫，可以最后减少死亡，造成美国几千万甚至上亿人以上的感染，过百万人的死亡，1兆元以上的经济损失，而且还没有过完。
As of today, China reported only 280,000 confirmed cases with 5,200 deaths.
I live in Jersey City, just outside of New York, and here it hit in a catastrophic way. Nursing homes really had refrigeration trucks outside for all the bodies. You had nurses, doctors working without any of the needed equipment, including having to use shower caps and ponchos and bandanas to cover themselves. I mean, there were just no provisions that existed even in US storage. They had to take emergency supplies from China even while attacking China. So we were gathering this material, connecting with each other, trying to produce it and get it out to as many people as possible. And this became the basis of our book, Capitalism on a Ventilator: The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, where we made this comparison of what public health means, even in a country far less developed, without the wealth that the United States has, was able to do more for its population than here in the center of the US, in the most modern cities.
Capitalism on a Ventilator, a book co-edited by Li Xiuhin and Sarah Flounders, is an anthropological reflection from 36 writers from around the world, including Margaret Flowers. The book was written between March to July of 2020, when the full impact of the COVID pandemic hit the US and when people were actively asking questions and looking for answers. The book was published in September 2020, but Amazon quickly banned the book from their website within 2 weeks.
When the book came out, it was, we initially tried to produce it through Amazon. They literally banned it. They wanted the title changed. Capitalism on a Ventilator wasn't suitable, and the content of the articles changed. We refused to do that, and we went ahead and published it ourselves.
We fought against the Amazon ban by filing appeal to their ban, but they are too arrogant to even talk to us seriously. We organized several press releases and webinars to denounce Amazon's ban on our book, but no US media, not even left progressive media, cover our story. 没办法，我们只能够是自己筹款，找商业的这种媒体公关公司帮我们在网上推广我们的书。其中有一家叫做 businesswire.com， 是美国最大的一个网络信息媒体推广的一个公关平台。但是当他看到我这个稿以后呢，不单只没有帮我们去推广，他立刻就把我的账号给封了，而且没有解释任何理由，知道吗？这个 Business Wire 老板呢，就是 Berkshire Hathaway 公司巴菲特拥有的。6 months passing, we thought there's no way we can beat the Amazon. Suddenly, in one day, we found China pick up our story on early March 2021. The China Daily and the Global Times. Both are English newspaper in China, very big one. Within 24 hours after the story was published in China, I found our book was reinstated into Amazon website. Yay! And we finally won. 通过这一次，在中国有人报道我们这本书，从报纸到电视，我们甚至还有电视讲了我们的事情。我们终于有机会在中国有人知道我们出版了这本书，然后有中国出版社主动找我们翻译成中文版，在2022年初出版中文版。
Now, 2.5 years later, Amazon does carry the book because it's really now dated. It's dealing with older figures and a different time, and it's no longer the threat. But to them at that time, they were producing countless books with really scurrilous conspiracy theories, blame China theories, and ineffective treatments that all were at great expense. That's the kind of book they were interested in, not as political and social controversy over, not a contribution to public health.
On late November 2022, due to the pressure from social and economic sectors of the society against dynamic zero COVID, the Chinese government announced to scale back the strict health policy, begin optimizing precise COVID prevention and control measures, issued the 920 rules, the list of 20 new COVID health rules, and added another 10 new ones in early December. It dropped contact tracking, lockdown, makeshift hospitals, and mass testing, shifting the anti-pandemic responsibility from the government to the individual. From January the 8th, 2023, China further downgraded the COVID management from Class A to Class B, no longer considering it a health threat and lifting all international travel restrictions for foreign travelers. But China's Freedom Day didn't happen. Instead, massive outbreaks quickly occurred across the country. However, unlike Western world, China has a very strong social support network organized by the Communist Party of China from the top to the street level, including medical workers, volunteers, business, and neighborhood committees. They responded to the local residents' appeals, gave up holidays to work overtime taking care of patients, and coordinating medicines to reach the patients, working tirelessly and sacrificing everything for the people. Many of them have been infected and continue working despite their own fevers. While one can argue the timing and the wisdom of the Chinese government's decision, everyone should agree, for the past 3 years China has saved millions of lives and protected a quarter of world population from the COVID, and its economy has done better than the US, something historically unprecedented on the fight against deadly virus. Again and again, what the COVID pandemic has revealed is, as exposed in the domestic failure of the United States, our inability to make sure that all people would be protected and get the healthcare they need. It has also exposed the destructive role of the United States in the world, its failure to cooperate with other countries, its protection of the profit of transnational corporations over the health of the people.
For here in the United States, the government invested billions of dollars into the research to develop the COVID-19 vaccines, but yet those pharmaceutical corporations that received that money are also profiting greatly off the sale of the vaccines. And when we look at how they negotiate prices with countries around the world, we see that for the poorer nations in the global south, they're being charged very high prices to receive the vaccine, often forcing them into having to take out loans through the US-dominated International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. This debt then causes greater harm to those countries, as often there are demands that the countries service that debt and make cuts to their own social infrastructure in order to have the money to pay off those debts. We see an incredible vaccine apartheid in the, shortly after the vaccines, months after the vaccines were developed and available, 10 of the wealthiest countries in the world were hoarding 75% of the vaccine stock. And we saw many countries, particularly countries in Africa, where they were not able to vaccinate people at all.
Now the figures are well over 1 million deaths in the US. It's almost at 1.1 million deaths. When we compare that to China, it's such a fraction.
Wealthy nations are hoarding most vaccines and denying them to poor nations. It's the US, UK against Europe, rich people against poor people, white against people of color, a racist vaccine pyramid that wealthy Western whites are at the top of the food chain and the non-white poor developing countries are always at the bottom. So far, very few Western-made vaccines has been delivered to the global South. The terms vaccine imperialism and distribution racism are based on rich countries buying up most Western-made vaccines, far more than they need, leaving very few for developing countries. 怎么可以做得到一个公平的疫苗分配给全世界？世界卫生组织跟 Gavi 和 CEPI 组成的 COVAX， 希望分配21支疫苗给190个国家，在1年以内，特别给92个最贫穷的国家，当98个相对比较富有的国家可以成就疫苗分配公平。However, order doesn't mean they have received the vaccines or even will receive them soon. At the February 19th United Nations meeting on COVID vaccines, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sharply criticized the widely uneven and unfair distribution of COVID vaccines, in which only 10 countries in the world, notably the US, Canada, and 8 Western European countries, have taken 75% of all vaccines doses, while 130 other countries have received not a single doses. 根据世贸组织2022年5月13号，全世界已经有152亿支的新冠疫苗，但是大部分都流向富有的发达的国家，而贫穷的南方国家比例上拿得非常小。好像很多其他的情况都一样，只要每一个公平的分配，足够每一个人都可以有疫苗接种，但事实这没有发生。And that's the vaccine nationalism, imperialism, and vaccine apartheid racism.
As of November 23, 2022, China has donated 328 million doses of vaccines and sold another 1.65 billion to other countries, making it the world's largest export country of vaccines that has contributed roughly 1/3 of the global export volume. According to the World Trade Organization data, in roughly the same period, the United States exported 968 million doses, that is, only half of the volume of China. Nonetheless, as per the US State Department, the United States has donated more than twice the number of vaccines to the world than that of China. 2/3 of the United States vaccine exports have been through donation. Sounds very generous? Well, in reality, it was for dumping vaccines near the expiring date. The World Health Organization has vehemently criticized rich countries for dumping near-expired COVID-19 vaccines to poor regions. A new report found that more than 1/3 of jabs donated around the world are yet to be administered, remain in storage, or have been wasted.
According to the US media, pharmacies and US government discarded 82.1 million COVID vaccine doses from December 2020 through mid-May 2022. Just over 11% of the doses the federal government distributed, including up to 17 million doses wasted between February to May. Rich countries can waste lots of vaccines and poor countries has nothing. That's crazy.
The COVID pandemic has exposed the failures of the United States domestically, with our inability to make sure that all people be protected and get the healthcare they need. It has also exposed the destructive role of the United States in the world, its failure to cooperate with other countries, and its protection of the profits of transnational corporations over the health of the people. But there is a more vicious role played by the United States in particular and the Western countries in general. They have been using sanctions as weapons against the world.
We can also see that sanctions was used where the vaccines were weaponized. What countries could receive the small supply of vaccines that were being distributed was based totally on who was complicit with the United States. Countries that were sanctioned in every way were prevented from receiving vaccines or the basic essential supplies. So Cuba could develop a vaccine, but the syringes, in order to deliver it to their own population, were in limited supply, and it was very difficult to get access.
The United States was playing a destructive role during that time. When the Secretary General of the United Nations was calling for an end to the US's illegal sanctions, the US escalated those sanctions, continued to put new sanctions on countries. And so as a result of that, countries really struggled to be able to get the items that they needed in order to take care of their population.
伊朗、古巴、委内瑞拉和阿富汗等国，美国对他们实施严厉的制裁，他们都没有收到任何美国的疫苗。美国甚至冻结他们去购买急需要治疗新冠的药物的外汇。
There are always winners and losers for the sanctions, but no doubt, US capitalists had been always the biggest winner from the sanctions. While the US and the West are imposing unilateral sanctions against Russia after the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, banning all Russian oil sales, yet, according to the Indian press, US is buying record amount of cheap Russian oil via India because a loophole in the sanction that do not apply to refined products produced from cheaper Russian crude oil exported from third countries, because these products are not considered Russian origin. United States has continued pressuring other countries to comply with sanctions, yet the US itself is using its own designed loopholes to strengthen their selfish interest. United States has been using the same dirty trick, using sanctions to force every country cannot buy for the sanctioned country, while US itself buying goods from the country they sanctioned for discounted price. During late 1990s, when the United Nations imposed sanctions by the demand of the United States and the West following Iraq invaded Kuwait 10 years earlier, under the UN program, Iraq can only sell its oil to the international market with discounted price through the UN Oil for Food program. US, while officially imposing oil embargo against Iraq at that time, secretly buying large amounts of Iraqi oil under the UN program with cheaper price. It sends a clear message to the world. The United States can use its military and political muscle to further its own economic interests. By undermining the international oil price, it sends an unquestionable message to the world. America is the only country that will decide who can produce, who can sell, and who can buy at what price. The brutal UN-US Western-imposed Iraq sanctions had caused 500,000 Iraqi children died during the 1990s. When asked by the reporter during a TV interview, then US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright spelled out the infamous "We think the price is worth it" quote.
In the days since the pandemic has ebbed back in national attention, we have very consciously moved forward with a campaign against US use of sanctions. But even this has now changed globally. The war in the Ukraine, the brutal NATO expansion into the Ukraine, the arming and weaponizing of the people in Ukraine, the firing on the Russian population in Ukraine, all of this created a crisis that could not be avoided.
According to Sanction Kills, an international campaign organized by many peace and justice organizations and activists, including Sarah Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and Lee Soo-hin, to criticize Western countries using sanctions as weapons against the world. Sanctions are essentially the imposition of arbitrary measures creating inhumane economic hardship on a targeted country. Sanctions from the United States affected a third of the world's population, imposing more than 8,000 measures on more than 40 countries. Economic sanctions are also known as embargoes.
The US effort to impose and to get all of the European Union and Britain to go along with the sanctions was to cut the trade relations with Russia. A very different thing happened though, and that is the rest of the world refused to go along with US sanctions because they were still able to trade with China and have economic relations and exchange. And so sanctions on Russia, and now new, even extensive sanctions on China, are not succeeding. The people of the world increasingly are deciding to do what is in their own interests. They have a population to feed, and they need food, fertilizer, technology, and they can't get that from the West except by onerous conditions that are an assault on their sovereignty. So we have produced a new book, which is an anthology looking at the both difference that exists now and also looking at sanctions as a weapon that is used again and again against. There's a whole study of the impact of US and UN sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, on Iran, on still today the continuing sanctions on Syria, and so on. But the more than 40 countries is a real theme that we take. The number of countries that are impacted affects a whole economy regionally. So we're trying to explain this to working people here, that these sanctions come back, they boomerang onto the economy here with increasing inflation, recession that really people are coping with in the layoffs and in an intensely fragile economy.
Sanctions, a wrecking ball in a global economy, is a book with several dozen writers, include Sarah Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and me. Comprehensive analysis against Western sanctions against other countries. The impact of sanctions on more than 40 developing and formerly colonized countries, countries 1/3 of the world population, was barely discussed in mainstream media for decades.
The book invited dozen activists from the Americas, Asia, Middle East, and Africa to discuss the devastating impact of US sanctions on other regions. With Margaret Flowers wrote Sanctions Kill Toolkit to understand the history of US sanctions and why we need to be against it.
I think, a necessity for the workers' movement in the US to explain to working people that racism, that bigotry, that attacks on another country are not in their own interests. And this really helps to combat also the anti-China sentiment that is being consciously whipped up every single day by the media. It's used to justify the new rounds of sanctions on China, whether it's in chips or whether it is in cotton from Xinjiang. Every form of U.S. policy is to intensify and to justify sanctions. And we feel that this has to be combated within the United States. This has to be explained again and again. The books are one way, the webinars are another, the demonstrations and rallies are still another. But it's important for working people to have their own voice in this, and not only the voice of corporate power.
On December 2022, Sarah Flounders invited Li Xuhin to New York, joining the Sanctions National Book Launching Tour. Community activists from 4 cities across the US invited authors of the book, including Sarah Flounders, Li Xuhin, and others, to speak at the local event. First stop is the Philadelphia. South Bronx, where Hostel's community college locate, is the poorest area in the New York City, has quickly gentrified by the real estate developers.
Why do you have to pay for tuition? You don't in other countries. Why is there no money for this? And why 3 years without a cafeteria? And even then, shouldn't the food be free?
Many countries' hardships has been related to the US imperialism, not only directly military intervention, covert actions, and also all this kind of regime change, but simply also an embargo, a sanctions that have been imposing to the country that created the huge economic impact and also kind of psychological warfare that making people had all this kind of social upheaval and then all this kind of different kind of the society crisis that forcing them to leave the country. They're coming not only because of economic hardship, but also psychological warfare that people think US is the best country in the world. After Trump president, that China's US trade war imposed by US to China against China using different kind of dozen, different, even hundreds, different type of sanctions, embargo, even directly targeting a private company called Huawei, the high-tech company, kidnapping the CFO of the Huawei in Canada, saying that she's violated the Iran sanction at the US, then they can impose the long arm to anyone down to the knees to listen to. Need to listen, otherwise you're going to suffer major consequences. That is a racism. That is an imperialism. That's making people of color in other parts of developing countries thinking like a white people in the US is a superior.
We are an all-volunteer effort. And in addition to the printed copy, where we can send you a link when you order the book to the EPUB version, so you can read it on an e-reader, computer, or smartphone. And the digital edition is particularly useful for reaching activists living outside the US, because printing books is pretty expensive, and we can forward the EPUB file. We're really interested in providing tools for grassroots political activists who are fighting and mobilizing for change. And the sanctions really understand what a brutal weapon, because it's a crisis that hits the most vulnerable. It creates millions of small personal crises. Essential medicines for diabetes, for high blood pressure, for small infections. A broken bone can be a death penalty. Polluted, untreated water, because there's no chlorine, is deadly. In international law, the targeting of civilians is always and totally off limits, even in a shooting war, in the midst of a war. And yet, US imperialism has perfected this form of siege warfare that deliberately targets civilians and the most vulnerable civilians, the young, the old, the chronically sick, the poorest. The sanctions are racist. They overwhelmingly target people of color in the global South, and sanctions come back and hit us here. But the ability of the US to enforce global domination is slipping. It's proof of its inability to enforce the devastating sanctions, the thousands of new sanctions on Russia and on China. The global South, the countries of Africa, Latin America, most of the countries of Asia, the formerly colonized world, are not complying with these thousands of sanctions imposed by the US and the European nations, the NATO members, the sanctions especially imposed on Russia. They need the grain, the energy, the resources, and the ability of the United States to create economic chaos has not succeeded. It is a shock to the powers that be here. The increased sanctions on China have a destructive impact on science and technology on a global scale. But cooperation is expanding among these sanctioned countries. We can look at the BRICS Plus, new levels of cooperation and trade agreements, the Belt and Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Problems are solved by cooperation and not by endless war and sanctions. They're solved by respect for sovereignty and independence and respect for different development paths, for multilateralism versus US hegemony. Now, where do we stand in all this? Working people right here need their own voice. We can't be chained to the corporate media and the capitalist threats. There are new agreements this week with China and the Gulf states and all the Arab countries. There's excited talk of international currency involving the yuan and the ruble and the rupee, and all of this challenges the almighty US dollar. So the world is changing rapidly.
Earlier this month, the US, South Korea, and Japan imposed coordinated unilateral sanctions against North Korea after the US failed to levy new international sanctions against North Korea, also known by its official name, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK. The US has imposed these sanctions in response to North Korea's missile launches this past year. North Korea is being cast as a pariah state, but in reality, the North Korean development of nuclear weapons is a strategy of deterrence against US imperial aggression. The US has occupied and demonized Korea ever since it achieved its independence from Imperial Japan. During the Korean War, US forces killed 3 to 5 million Koreans. This is a number that essentially amounts to genocide. The US dropped more aerial bombs on North Korea than it did in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. And to this day, the Korean War is not over, thanks to US interest in keeping Korea divided. The ceasefire signed in 1953 did not end the war. In fact, and while sanctions are just one part of the imperialist playbook, their effects can be devastating. One of the most sanctioned countries in the world, North Korea can't trade with other countries, receive international loans, or import fuel or much of anything else. From agriculture to industry, sanctions impact all aspects of life in North Korea. Most things North Koreans need, they have to produce for themselves. There is no getting it from somewhere else. Sanctions impact water, sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare infrastructure. According to UNICEF, over 9.75 million people do not have access to safely managed drinking water. Crucially, one of the many types of items that North Korea is banned from importing due to sanctions is water sanitation equipment. Under sanctions, seeds, fertilizers, and agricultural equipment and other types of machinery are banned. And contrary to popular narratives that claim North Korea's government is intentionally withholding food from its population, food insecurity in the country is driven by a lack of access to modern agricultural equipment and techniques, and is amplified by natural disasters and the impacts of climate change. The US condemns human rights in North Korea, yet in the same breath, it violates those very rights by imposing deadly sanctions. The US claims to want to end the Korean War, yet in the same breath, the US imposes greater sanctions as an act of warfare, knowing full well that North Korea sees lifting sanctions as a precondition to negotiations to ending the war. We must not be fooled by the rhetoric of the United States, but look instead at its actions. And despite these repressive US policies, North Korea has resisted sanctions and managed to hold its own and provide for its people. The North Korean people themselves continue to stay resilient and adapt to the many challenges they face, through remarkable advancements in agriculture, energy, and textile and steel production. Sanctions will continue to serve as a major barrier to renewing peace talks between the two Koreas. We must organize against imperialist sanctions in order to achieve peace, liberation, and reunification in Korea.
The People's Forum, one of the most famous progressive activist gathering place in New York City, they have meeting rooms, library, coffee house, and book publisher.
Next up, we're going to hear from about another country, resilient and determined, by Roger Wareham of the December 12th movement, who has organized solidarity with Zimbabwe under sanctions for decades. The largest number, actually, of sanctioned countries are African countries. It's a new colonialism. It's meant to divide and redivide, but particularly the campaign around Zimbabwe, I think, stands out some of the strongest of the sanctions. So, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this campaign, the campaign inviting us to participate in the campaign. Until recently, particularly in the left, the sanctions on Zimbabwe were not really well known. And as Sarah was pointing out, the U.S. rationale for imposing sanctions is that the targeted country or the targeted people pose a national threat to U.S. security or pose a threat to U.S. national security. The only threat that Zimbabwe represented at the time the sanctions were imposed was that they really had the temerity and the audacity to just take their land back from the descendants of the settlers who stole it. That was it. Until that time, if you look back at Zimbabwe's independence struggle and when they achieved independence in 1980, it was a compromise that was reached. They were about to win on the battlefield, but the South Africans who supported the Rhodesians had basically were saying that if the armed struggle didn't stop in Zimbabwe, they were going to continue to bomb civilians in the countries that had supported that struggle, in Zambia, Tanzania. And so a compromise was reached at Lancaster House in Great Britain in 1980. And part of that compromise was that there would be one man, one vote, majority rule, but that for the first 10 years, the representatives of the white minority, and they were truly a minority in that country, would have a certain number of seats delegated in their legislature, in the parliament. In that same period of time, there would be an agreement of one seller, one buyer, that the whites who own the land would sell the land back to Zimbabweans, which is an interesting concept, that the thief would also be able to benefit from their thievery. That agreement was underwritten with the understanding that the money to pay the settlers would come from Great Britain and the United States. For some reason, who knows, I mean, how the United States got involved in that, that's the old kith and kin rap that they maintain to this day. So you rub my back, I'll rub your back. At that point in time, President Robert Mugabe, who had been portrayed in the Western press as the George Washington of his country, he was a consummate Democrat. He was the model that African leaders should model themselves after, according to the West. At the point in time when Zimbabwe said, no, we're taking our land back, then he morphed from George Washington to Adolf Hitler. I mean, they began to portray him as the Black Hitler, and they imposed the sanctions. And very interestingly, one of the sponsors of the resolution of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001 was Hillary Clinton.
Burning books, A famous local anarchist Marxist bookstore in Buffalo, New York, carry many activist books printed in the United States.
They are harmful to the entire planet, and we're going to talk about how we can fight them, because this isn't just informational, but we're going to talk about some of the ongoing campaigns that are actively fighting U.S. sanctions and imperialism around the world. And we're going to talk about why we as working class people here in the Imperial Core should care about this.
Haiti, Iran, Iraq, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Laos, Lebanon, Liberia, Libya, Mali, Moldova, Montenegro, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Palestine, Paraguay, Russia, Serbia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, Uganda, and Venezuela.
Today, December 10th, which is celebrated around the world, if not in the US, as the International Human Rights Day. Ironic in the sense that what we are talking about and what we will further explore is the systematic attempt on the part of the US settler colonial state to deny the most elementary human rights to masses of people in this country and around the world. It's important to note that the U.S. is the leader of the Western Bloc, and its objective is to maintain the global hegemony of the pan-European white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy that emerged in 1492 and represents the hegemonic force that we are all struggling against today. In order to maintain that hegemony, they have decided that they are going to engage in open forms of warfare. And it's important to note that this sanctioned weapon is in fact a weapon of war. It has devastating consequences for societies throughout the world, and it results in death and destruction in a real way.
Since February this year, the imperialist powers of the US, Canada, the European Union, and Britain have imposed massive, unprecedented, unilateral, and illegal sanctions against Russia. These sanctions are very wide-ranging. Russia's been cut out of SWIFT, which is the global messaging network for international payments, in order to try and cripple the Russian economy. Russian banks have had their assets frozen, over $1 trillion worth of assets. Biden ordered a ban on Russian energy imports to the US. Easy enough for him to do, given that the US was importing precious little Russian energy in the first place. But the story in Europe is much more complicated. Germany, for example, has been reliant on Russian energy for more than 50 years. It's kind of interesting to observe here that no countries whatsoever were sanctioned as a result of the West's genocidal wars on Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Libya, or Yugoslavia. You know, there's this liberal narrative going around that, well, Russia's invaded another country and, you know, we've got to do something, therefore sanctions are justified. Even if you accept that argument, and obviously you should at least ask why these rules don't apply when it's the US and its allies that are doing the invading. You know, the corner of Biden's foreign policy has been to essentially recreate the Cold War alliance, you know, when the freedom-loving West united under US leadership against the evil commies of the East. And now Biden is looking to get the band back together, to revive that same project, a hybrid war against socialism, against sovereignty, and against multipolarity. It's a manifestation of the project for a new American century. Now that was a neocon project, a neocon concept, a Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz concept, but it's been taken up by successive Democratic and Republican administrations. As far as foreign policy is concerned, there's only one party, the War Party.
Today, I want to talk about the effects of U.S. sanctions, or unilateral coercive measures on the developing nations in the Middle East. The group of countries I'm going to talk about, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and critically Palestine, can be referred to as the axis of resistance. They are the axis of resistance to the Israeli occupation of Palestine and to Western imperialism. In 2006, U.S. sanctions banned companies from doing business with the Palestinian Authority. Public schools and hospitals, along with other government services, were targeted by these sanctions. Meanwhile, individual members of the PA were enriched under the table so they will enforce the Israeli and U.S. policies. Today, following a fierce 10-year proxy war, Syria has 1/3 of its territory occupied by the U.S. and its allies. Turkish-backed terrorists continue to control Syria's Idlib province, while Israel has annexed the Golan and routinely bombs Syrian territory from there. A proxy force led by the U.S. allied Kurds administers an area in the northeast of the country, which includes most of Syria's oil wells, their wheat-producing region, and a significant water source, the Euphrates. The area is protected by approximately 1,000 U.S. soldiers. With the country devastated by bombing raids and terrorist attacks, the U.S. placed new sanctions on Syria. These sanctions, ironically defined by the U.S. Caesar Civilian Protection Act, include what are called secondary sanctions, which punish any country or business that provides any support to the primary sanctioned country. Meanwhile, the Caesar sanctions are specifically tailored to prohibit reconstruction in Syria. They have not only destroyed the Syrian economy, but in conjunction with the theft of Syrian oil and wheat resources, they have devastated the population. Due to the secondary sanctions, international companies are afraid to provide any resources due to the fear of U.S. retaliation. Since Syrian banking and much of their import-export business was either directly with Lebanon or processed through Lebanese banks, the secondary sanctions on Syria brought down the already fragile and corrupt economy of Lebanon as well. And with the collapse of the banks in Lebanon, the equally unstable and corrupt government has collapsed as well. Elena Duhan, the United Nations Rapporteur on Secondary Sanctions, recently visited Syria. On her return, she demanded that the sanctions on Syria be lifted immediately.
Now globally, the United States is trying desperately to hold on to its domination of the world, and it's failing. It's not going to succeed because the world has seen and knows that the United States is not a reliable partner, is not an honest partner, will always put the profits of the corporations over the lives of its own people and people anywhere in the world. And the United States is harming itself by not cooperating with China and learning from the actions that China has taken over the past 70 years. The United States needs to let go of this hubris, of this American exceptionalism, and recognize that we have a lot to learn from people all around the world, and that it's necessary for our future that we become a nation of cooperation, of solidarity, of one that values human life and protection of the planet. The United States' future depends upon this change.
In contrast to the sanctions and vaccine imperialism of the United States against the world, China has launched successful vaccine diplomacy to support the world. Also, China supports global economic developments by encouraging more international economic cooperation. Last November, China organized the 5th China International Import Expo to encourage more global imports, especially imports from the Global South.
在进博会，中国非常慷慨，开他们的大门，邀请全世界，甚至包括许多目前对中国实施无数制裁的国家的公司，也被容许来销售他们的产品。
End sanctions now.
Let's end sanctions and nurture our global communities.
Sanctions now! Stop the sanctions!
I'm Dean Knight speaking from New York. I want to congratulate China on successfully overcoming COVID, even though it's important to know it's not over. And we know you can do it. That's the most amazing thing. You're a success in overcoming the pandemic.
End the sanctions now!
Let me read a chapter I wrote from the capitalism on a ventilator. It's no secret that domestically, police brutality and the war on terror is in fact just more oppression for Black and immigrant communities. There won't be health justice in the US unless there's a people's revolution for fundamental social change that demand the moving of money and wealth from the richest 1% and the war back to the working class, people of color, immigrants, and indigenous people.